So this is a bit of an introduction to the material that we're looking at this morning. Yeah, so last night we had a little bit of a recap, and some of you might have heard this from listening to the talk Levels of Going for Refuge, particularly from Bhante, Sangharakshita. And what I did is remind us of Bhante's understanding of the refuges in the three yanas. So that's the three great movements of Buddhist teaching of the Dharma. And of course, this is very important to Bhante because his understanding of the Dharma and understanding of the understanding on which he founded the order and movement is the centrality of going for refuge to the three jewels of Buddhism. So in a way, his life's work was really penetrating into the depths of what the three refuges really are and how to understand them. So in early Buddhism, what we find is that the Dharma means the direct teaching of the Buddha given to individuals for them to learn the Dharma, for them to reflect on the Dharma. So you have this sort of scenario repeated again and again in the Buddhist teachings, which are the Buddhist wanderers meeting the Buddha or meeting one of the senior Buddhist disciples and talking about the Dharma, talking about the way to truth. And the whole picture of it is very responsive. So you have the Buddha responding to the individual character of the person that he's meeting and giving them a teaching that's directly relevant to them. It's a personal interaction as he wandered around northern India, wandered around the Ganges basin. And these teachings that he gave to his disciples were memorized, particularly by Ananda, but not only by Ananda. The Itivuttaka is an interesting text because it was memorized by not only a woman, but a woman who was a servant girl in the royal household amongst the royal women, and remembered the Buddha's teaching verbatim. So the Buddhist teaching was memorized, was handed on. People would learn their particular relevant piece of Dharma, usually in verse form. And every full moon, they'd get together and they'd recite what they'd learned and they'd recite their reflections on that Dharma. So it's a very kind of personal approach to the Dharma, very relevant to one's own individual needs and individual character. But sadly for us, the Buddha entered into his parinibbana, probably not sadly for him, but sadly for us. And he was no longer present to teach individuals. The Dharma became, in the later tradition of Buddhism, usually about they say about 500 years after the Buddha died, the Mahayana schools of Buddhism sought to not only limit the Dharma to what the Buddha had particularly handed on and those teachings that had been handed down through the centuries, but also to what the Dharma really was, not confined to the time of the Buddha and to the time the Buddha lived, and not confined to that area of the Ganges basin. But what is the Dharma in its essence? What is the Dharma that's universal to all of us? Now that the Buddha has entered into his parinibbana and he's no longer physically present with us, what is the Dharma in its universalized understanding, in its universalized essence? And the Dharma becomes not just those particular teachings, but the Buddha's stream of spiritual influence that we can tap into even now, even beyond the words themselves. So they have this beautiful image, which I really love, which is that in some way, the Buddha is always at the Vulture's Peak, this place that's real. I've been to the Vulture's Peak. He did preach there. But in the Mahayana's universalized understanding, The Buddha is always there at the vulture's peak, constantly proclaiming the Dharma. Because the Dharma also isn't just, it's not just the Buddha's teachings themselves, it's also the truth itself. And the truth is always present. The truth is always available to us if we only stopped and listened. So the Mahayana has this universalized conception of the Dharma, where the Buddha is always teaching on the vulture's peak, and it's up to us to remain receptive to it. It's not limited by words. It's not limited by what the Buddha was supposed to have actually said. It's not limited by 2,500 years ago in the Ganges Basin. So you get this very, very broad understanding of the sort of universal essence of Buddhism. And then we have the Vajrayana coming after the Mahayana, which was concerned with, okay, here's the Buddha's stream of spiritual influence, but how do we experience it right here and now? That all sounds well and good, but what does it actually mean to us? How do we directly experience that stream of spiritual influence? And their understanding of the Dharma became the Yidam, which Bhante describes as that special aspect of the Dharma, that special aspect of enlightenment or reality through which the disciple approaches the enlightenment experience. And that was usually envisaged as a particular form that represents an aspect of the Buddha's enlightened consciousness, a Buddha or a Bodhisattva figure. So what the Vajrayana are doing here is that they're taking that breadth of Buddhism, and remember that the Vajrayana, sometimes one gets the impression that the Vajrayana schools don't emphasize study. I have to say that couldn't be further from the truth. So the Vajrayana schools really, really do emphasize a lot of study of all the early tradition and the Mahayana tradition in its depth. So just to give you an example, Yeshe Sogyal, the great hero of mine, she was Padmasambhava's disciple. Before Padmasambhava would give her any teachings of sadhana, of Buddhas or Bodhisattva figures, he asked her to go on solitary retreat in a cave for 7 years and study the Abhidharma. So when you've been alone in a cave for 7 years studying the Abhidharma, maybe then you could just drop study a bit. But until that point, I think we should carry on. I remember once being, I did a kind of little retreat myself in Bodh Gaya, and I was spending every morning in meditation and study and reflection. And because I was going to the same spot, wedged between 2 stupas in the Mahabodhi complex, because I was going to the same spot every day, I got to know some of the Tibetan monks who were also on retreat there. And we talked to each other about our study practice. And I have to say, I was extremely grateful, not only to Bhante, but also to the fact that I'd done a good degree in Buddhist philosophy, because their level of study was way exceeding mine. But because of Bhante's ecumenical approach, I did know about Vasubandhu and Atisha and Asanga and Tsongkhapa and all the great Buddhist teachers that they were studying. So in the Vajrayana, what you have is a very intensive study practice, particularly studying the Indian and Tibetan teachers. And that is crystallized, all of that work is crystallized, is condensed into the form of the awakened consciousness that you have a commitment to visualizing and to meditating upon. That's why we have these enormous libraries at the Potala Palace, which they're only just allowing scholars to enter. Huge tantric libraries. Just found the Sanskrit version of the Vimla-Kirti Nadesha, which we thought wasn't in existence, but apparently the libraries in the Potala Palace in Tibet are so large, no one knows what's in them. Clearly they don't have an index, which is a shame. So Yes, so the Vajrayana are taking all that very, very intensive study and crystallizing it into a form with which you become familiar and intimate and meditate upon again and again. So what I was saying last night, and what I think is interesting, is when you listen to Bhante talking about the esoteric Dharma refuge being the Yidam, you really get the impression that this is very, very important to him. Very, very important to his understanding of the Dharma. Because I think that Bhante also had those same questions that the Vajrayana poses. What is the Dharma to us? How do we directly experience that stream of spiritual influence? Bhante was bringing Buddhism to a very, very different world than the traditional Buddhist world in which he'd been introduced to Buddhism. He was coming over to the UK in the 1960s. And at that time in the UK, what was available to him was either very traditional Buddhism with a strong monastic lay split in the Hampstead Buddhist Vihara, or Buddhism that was an intellectual exercise. You didn't have to be a Buddhist to go along to the Buddhist society. You just had to have an interest in Buddhist texts and Buddhist philosophy. They didn't have an emphasis on meditation or ritual at that time in the Buddhist society. If you want to read about that, do read Nagabodhi's book, The Boy, the Monk, the Man, or read Moving Against the Stream, because it really gives you an insight into why Bhante founded the order that he did. And he founded the order that he did partly because he wanted to really, really understand why, what is the Dharma really in our lives, in our actual experience. And he said of himself, he never just read the Buddhist scriptures to understand what the Buddha said. He was mainly concerned with why the Buddha said it. So it's not just what he said, but why he actually said it. And you can really get the flavor of that when he unpacks some of these large Mahayana sutras or tantric texts or the Pali canon. He's really sort of taking it to another level of not only, okay, what did the Buddha say, or what does this Buddhist text say, what does it mean, but why? Why is it emphasizing this point? What's the kind of, in a way, the magic and the mystery behind it? What's it trying to communicate to us as spiritual beings with potential to enlightenment? That's what he was trying to understand. And that's what I think makes him a tremendously exciting teacher. He was bringing Buddhism to a world where the Buddha has gone, the historical Buddha has gone, and yet traditional Buddhism cannot be accepted wholesale. So we've got this world where we don't accept the Buddha's teaching absolutely. We don't have the view that just because it's the Buddha said it, it must be right, or just because a monk said it, it must be right. We're also living in a world of Buddhism where everything is on offer. Like I was saying last night, you can go into a bookshop and you can find shelves of books on Buddhism with all sorts of subjects, from traditional Buddhism, monastic Buddhism, to Buddhism applied to politics and the environmental crisis and all these things. Everything is on offer. And in that sort of overwhelm of information, and that's books, not to mention the internet, which wasn't around when Bhante started the movement. In all of that, in that kind of overwhelm, it's very easy to think of Buddhism as something we have to intellectually understand, because we can't penetrate to the depth of all these books. We think, well, if we get an intellectual understanding, that'll be enough. We prioritize the rational understanding. So Bhante could see all this. He could see all this happening even within his lifetime. And so his central question was, okay, well, in this picture of world history, we're not accepting the teachings wholesale just on faith. And yet we've got so many teachings to read and understand. We're going to prioritize our intellect. where is the Dharma for us? Where is the Dharma that we can actually practice and allow to transform our lives? And he calls the esoteric Dharma refuge, he calls it the Dharma which we've actually experienced. It's that Dharma which is the Dharma to which we really go for refuge. This is the esoteric Dharma refuge. We go for refuge only to the Dharma we actually practice in any real, deep, living sense. So in a way, the question of the weekend is, what Dharma do we actually practice in any real, deep, living sense? What Dharma do we actually practice in any deep, real, deep, living sense? So let's go back to the process of Buddhist history and go back to the early Buddhists and see what their experience was, or try and imagine what their experience was and what we might get from that. So the early Buddhists didn't read or write. Some of the merchant classes, I think, did have some reading or writing, but the Dharma definitely wasn't written down at the time of the Buddha, and it's unlikely that the Buddha would have read or written. So people were given as individuals verses to learn, to reflect on, and to meditate on. And we have collections of those verses, of those discourses, particularly if you look at the chapter of the eights and the way to the beyond question and answers in the Sutta Nipata. These are some very, very old texts, the Dhammapada, the Itivuttaka, the Udana verses. All of these are quite early verses or summaries of Buddhist teachings that were memorized by the monks and nuns and turned over in their minds. Actually, not just monks and nuns, also lay people. Turned over in their mind so that they could listen and reflect on those teachings. I'll give you a little story about it, which you may know. It's from the Dharma Sutta. So in the Dharma Sutta, we've got the Buddha wandering, as he regularly did. He's wandering on his own, and he's looking for somewhere to stay the night. And he finds a potter's shed. And he says to the potter, "Could I stay in your shed overnight?" And the potter recognizes him as what we call a wandering mendicant, a sort of wandering holy man. He says, "Yes, that's fine. You can stay the night here." But there is actually another wandering mendicant, wandering holy man, who's staying in the shed at the moment. So you might just need to check with him first. So the Buddha goes in and he introduces himself as a wanderer. He doesn't name himself. And asks if he could also share the potter's shed overnight. And Pukusati is there, and Pukusati says, "Yeah, that's fine, you can stay the night with me." So they go into the potter's shed, they get some grass. I don't know where they get the grass from, maybe outside. They make themselves a little cushion and they spend the night in meditation. They don't sleep, they spend the night in meditation. And in the morning, the Buddha's really quite impressed with Pukusati, and he says, "So you're a wanderer, as I am. With whom have you gone forth? Whose teachings do you follow?" And Pukusati says, "Oh, I follow the Buddha's teachings." And the Buddha said, "Oh, interesting. Have you met the Buddha?" He says, "No, I've never met the Buddha. I wouldn't know him if I saw him." Oops. But the Buddha doesn't give the game away. He doesn't reveal his true identity. He says, "Well, would you like to discuss the Dharma?" And Pukusati said, "Oh, yes, I would." So the Buddha starts giving him a teaching. And what he gives him is what we know as the 6-element practice, which we take shortly before our ordinations. So he teaches him the 6-element practice. And as he's teaching him the 6-element practice, somehow it dawns on Pukusati that this is, in fact, the Buddha who's talking to him. He recognizes the Buddha. And when the Buddha's finished speaking, he says, "I would like, you are the Buddha, and I didn't recognize you, and I'd like to confess that." And the Buddha said, you've made a real and true confession, and your confession is accepted. So I find this a very fascinating incident, not only because the Buddha's teaching him the 6-element practice, which we do in the order, but also because of this dynamic. What happened to Pukusati that at some point of the Buddha teaching him the Dharma, Pukusati recognized the Buddha for who he really was? There's something where the Buddha's teaching became internalized. There's a shift in perception where it's not just an interesting teaching by a good teacher. There's a recognition that the Buddha is present. How does Pukusati know? At what point does he know it's actually the Buddha who's talking to him? I find that a complete mystery. There's some intimacy, there's some reverence, there's something very personal that happens within Pukusati. There's a shift in his being. And it's interesting also that he should then confess that, and that the Buddha should accept his confession as a confession. I mean, you'd think that the Buddha would just say, look, it's all right, there's no problem, I didn't say who he was. But it's almost like the Pukusati realizes that his understanding hadn't gone deep enough before to understand it was the Buddha. And that through that discourse, through that Dharma talk, Dharma kata, somehow he knew it was the Buddha. And he knew that his understanding of the Dharma had somehow sort of chunked down a level. I'm going to give you another story of a sort of similar nature. Nakula Pita. So Nakula Pita was an old man who went to see the Buddha. And he said to him, you know, it's not often that I get to see the Buddha or the Buddha's disciples who nourish the mind. I love that little expression, who nourish the mind. He said, it'd be very good, you know, I'm in the last phase of my life. Death is not far away, and I'd really love it if you could give me a Dharma teaching that I could practice, that I could learn and reflect on. May the Buddha, Blessed One, teach me. May the Blessed One instruct me for my long-term benefit and happiness. So the Buddha looks at this old man in the last phase of his life, heading towards death. And he says this, he says, so you should train yourself. Even though I may be afflicted in my body, my heart will be unafflicted. Even though I may be afflicted in my body, my heart or mind, chitta, will be unafflicted. And Nakula is delighted, Nakula Pita is delighted with this teaching. He understands it directly and intuitively. And he goes outside the Buddha's, what we might imagine to be the Buddha's chamber or hut where he was dwelling, where he'd had a sort of audience with the Buddha. And he came out and he just sat outside, utterly delighted. And Sariputta, one of the Buddha's disciples, comes along and he sees Nakula Pita, and Nakula Pita is radiant. He says, friend, you're radiant, you're clear. Your faculties are serene and bright and glowing. He says, what's happened? And Nakula Pita says, I have been sprinkled by the deathless. I have been sprinkled by the deathless Dharma talk, by the Bhagavan, by the Blessed One. So this is very, very fascinating. A very simple teaching that he could go away, that he could train in, not just listen to, but train in. Even though I may be afflicted in body, my heart will be unafflicted. That's all it was. But he knew it, and he recognized the Buddha in it, and it changed him, it transformed him. He was sprinkled by the deathless, and his whole countenance changed. His whole being started to glow and radiate. So we get the impression that the Buddha teaching the Dharma was something more than a good book. The Dharma soaks into your bones, it becomes you, it transforms your very being, transforms the way you look at the world, it transforms the way you act, the way you experience the world. And this is what we have in 3 levels of wisdom. So in the 3 levels of wisdom, we have listening, reflecting, meditating. So the first level of wisdom is that you listen to the Dharma, you hear the Dharma. It's actually listening, literally hearing the Dharma. Sutta mai pranya, or panya. So you listen to the Dharma and then you reflect on it. Chitta, you take it to heart. You turn it over in your mind. You wear it smooth with the retelling in your heart and mind, in your chitta. And then you become that teaching. It's not just something you reflect on, it's something that you actually are. The process happens the other way as well. So we have the Buddha's enlightenment experience where he is understood the Dharma beyond words and concepts, beyond the reasoning mind. But of course, he has to communicate it. Because he has to communicate it, he has to reflect on it. And he has to express it in words and concepts. So he's going from meditating or becoming to reflecting to telling, and we're going from listening to reflecting to becoming or meditating upon. So you're moving from the expression to the insight itself, the insight that gave rise to the expression. Or from the Buddha's point of view, you're moving from the insight beyond words and concepts to an expression. And in that way, that's how we meet the Buddha. We move from expression to insight beyond words and concepts. And the Buddha moves from insight to expression. The way that Bhante puts this is in the Survey of Buddhism, I find very beautiful, actually. He talks about it as a poem. He talks about the Dharma as a poem, the poem of which reveals the secrets of the spiritual life. And he says it's a bit like with a poem, you listen, you reflect on the poem, and you enter the mood that gave rise to the poem. You get, through listening and reflecting on the poem, you sort of enter the mind of the poet when he wrote that, or she wrote that poem. And in the same way, through listening to the poem of the Dharma itself, through the rhythm, the words, and the imagery of the Dharma, we get a glimpse of the mind of the Buddha himself. We become the mood of the Buddha that expressed those words. We become part of the consciousness, the awareness of the Buddha that expressed those words. The secrets of the holy life are ours, as Sangharakshita talks about it. He says that it's ethics that are the words of that poem. Wisdom is the imagery, and meditation is the rhythm of the poem. So through ethics, meditation, and wisdom, we understand the poem itself, the poem of the Dharma life. We understand the secrets that gave rise to it. And through that, through the words and imagery and rhythm of the Dharma, we glimpse the mind of the Buddha himself. We glimpse the mind of the universal Buddha, the Buddha beyond time and space, beyond the historical Buddha, but maybe the mind of all Buddhas of all times. So that's the process that the Vajrayana was drawing attention to. Where is it that the Dharma comes alive? Where is it that we are sprinkled? We recognize the Buddha himself as the teacher of the Dharma directly. Where do we feel the Dharma deeply? Where do we allow the Dharma to transform us deeply, deeply? And that's what Bhante wanted to know. In the 20th or the 21st century, in the modern world, where do we recognize the Buddha communicating with us? Where do we hear him preaching on the Vulture's Peak? Where do we hear him so deeply that we leave behind self-construction? Where do we hear him so deeply that we're sprinkled by the deathless? And again, it's taking the question of Bhante, not only what did the Buddha say, but why did he say it? Why did he say it? So the Vajrayana kind of crystallized these questions, as I said, they crystallized the Dharma itself, those teachings of the Dharma, into a form in which we can recognize the mind of the Buddha speaking to us and the Dharma itself. Crystallized the Dharma into a form that communicates all that we can learn and that we're intimate with. It's our own personal teaching that leads us beyond the personal. So it's these figures in Buddhism, the figure of the Buddha or the Bodhisattva, that embodies various aspects of the Buddha's enlightened consciousness, the Buddha's enlightened awareness, that we can move through that form to experience the awareness directly. It's got to be a form that we love, that we're attracted to, that absorbs us. So yeah, so it also brings to mind a central question of Bhante's, which he talks about, particularly in Precious Teachers, how to go beyond the ego. He even wrote an essay on it in Crossing the Stream. We found that essay in Crossing the Stream. How to go beyond the ego. Because what we're trying to do with Buddhism is we're trying to go beyond self-clinging, and yet we're using our sort of self-clinging to go beyond self-clinging. This is the great kind of paradox. We're using our desire to sort of improve ourselves, if you like, to go beyond improving ourselves. He says it's a bit like in Buddhist practice, you're trying to get rid of self-clinging by pushing it out the front door, but it just sneaks around the back. And we can experience this ourselves, you know, sort of trying to go beyond self-clinging, but it's the self-clinging that's trying to go beyond self-clinging. It's the sort of positive self-clinging, the self-clinging that wants us to be better than we are, that wants us to be enlightened being, in a sense, that remove the unskillful self-clinging. But what Bhante realized, and this is partly through reading Thomas Merton's Seeds of Contemplation and through his Tibetan teachers who started to arrive in Kalimpong, and also Chinese. Yogi Chen was Chinese. But as these sort of tantric teachers came into Kalimpong, where he was living, and started to teach him the sort of richness of Buddhism, he realized that to go beyond the self, he needed a transcendental counterpart, which he calls a transcendental counterpart. So you go beyond self-clinging by not imagining enlightenment as you much, much cooler, much more wise and cleverer, which is how we usually, to be honest, sort of visualize enlightenment. It's just like me, but great. Maha me. Enlightenment as Maha me. He realized that what you needed was as an image of liberation that's beyond the ego altogether, the transcendental counterpart. And the way you do that is taking up a sadhana practice, your visualization of a Buddha or Bodhisattva figure. So he asked Chatrul Rinpoche to give him a Buddha or Bodhisattva figure that he could reflect on. And Chatrul Rinpoche gave him green Tara, as we know and love. And it's interesting, when he talks about being given the green Tara sadhana, he says, I had an affinity with green Tara, and it was on account of that affinity that I could, by devotion to her, by becoming her, most readily gain access to the transcendental realm to which she belonged. He had an affinity with green Tara. Green Tara had an affinity with him, a kind of intimacy with each other, a sort of personal relationship. And it was on account of that affinity that he could, by devotion to her, by becoming her, not becoming Maha Sangharakshita, but by becoming green Tara herself, that he could most readily gain access to the transcendental realm to which he belonged. So this is our access point to the mind, the awareness that gave rise to the Yidam, the sadhana practice in the first place. Yidam literally means oath bound. We're committed to this particular figure, to a personal relationship with the Dharma embodied or crystallized in this particular figure for the rest of our lives. And we keep meditating on that figure. And through that meditation, we enter into the awareness that gave rise to that figure. We're committed to that figure. The Sanskrit is Ishta Devata. And Ishva is a very interesting word. It's a very strong word, a very loving word. It means wished, desired, longed for, beloved, agreeable, liked, favorite, dear, personal, worshipped, reverenced, and respected. Very, very, very beautiful word, actually. You get the idea. What gives rise is something very personal and very intimate, like a lover in a sense, but more than a lover that moves beyond itself. It's worshipped, it's reverenced, it's respected. So we become intimate with the consciousness that is evoked by a particular figure in the Dharma, Buddha or Bodhisattva figure. I think we could also say with the esoteric Dharma refuge, we might also become intimate with a particular teaching. So usually we imagine that the teaching, to become intimate with a teaching, it has to be in a kind of personal form, because then you come into a relationship with a personal form or with the Dharma embodied. That's why it's embodied, because you can come into a personal relationship and communication with an embodied form more easily than an abstracted form. But I think also we can become intimate with the Dharma itself and the words of the Dharma itself. And through becoming intimate with that Dharma teaching or with that Dharma figure, we move from the form itself to the secrets that it's expressing. From the expression to the mind that gave rise to that expression, from the imagery to the awareness that formed the imagery. There's these wonderful lines by Yeshe Sogya, which I've slightly adapted to purpose, but she's talking about the Padmasambhava sadhana, but I've slightly adapted her words to just say Yidam. And what she says is, rely on these words that you have asked for. Draw reverence and humility from your very bones. Meditate only on the brilliance of the Yidam's pure awareness. Visualize the Yidam. Let the visualization penetrate you so that you and the Yidam become one. Whatever experiences arise, just let them be. So here we have these lines. Meditate only on the brilliance of the Yidam's pure awareness. Meditate on that, the brilliance of the Yidam's pure awareness. And I've been doing a sadhana practice for nearly 20 years. So that's pretty much every day, not completely every day, but pretty much every day, meditating on the form of white Tara. And recently, some of you know, I for a fundraiser for Triratna Loka Unlimited, I did a meditation diary for 108 days. And what I discovered in that, first of all, I discovered that, like, how religious I am. I realized, I was thinking, well, wait, what am I doing? You know, what am I doing every morning, meditating this kind of white figure on a white lotus and internally chanting a mantra? And I realized the sort of distillation of my understanding of that process was that it's really to do with the force of familiarization. So what I'm doing with my mind there is I'm familiarizing myself with the pure awareness of Tara, the specific pure awareness that Tara represents, the compassion which is embodied in the figure of white Tara, which is is quite different from the compassion embodied by green Tara, for example. It's very, very specific. The compassion, the pure awareness that's in this particular form. And becoming intimate with that awareness that's beyond my own awareness. So instead of becoming intimate and familiar just with the mind flavored by the hindrances, the consciousness flavored by the hindrances, becoming intimate with the mind of Tara herself and the pure awareness that she represents. Becoming more familiar with the pure awareness of white Tara than I am with my own habitual consciousness. And I realized the significance of this when I had a very serious car accident, because I really did think my time was up. And as I was spinning 360 degrees on the M4 across 2 lanes of traffic into the central reservation, what I was aware of was very, very distinctly a consciousness that was white Tara's. The only way I could describe it is white Tara's consciousness. I didn't see an image. I didn't see a figure. I didn't see anything. I just felt this consciousness, and I knew it to be white Tara's because it was a form of consciousness very, very familiar to me. And I just felt this upwelling of gratitude for that. Then interestingly, it was a very interesting experience because I hit the central reservation, of course, sort of came to a halt and thought, my first question to myself is, have I broken my commitments? And then I thought, no. And then I thought, am I dead? And I thought, clearly not. And then, am I injured? It was in that order, actually. Very, very interesting, that. So yeah, so what it made me think was there's a force of familiarization in doing these practices that carries us beyond death. That's what I'm coming to with this little story. Yeah, I'm convinced of that. And that's why you make a commitment. You just keep doing that, and your consciousness becomes very, very familiar with this embodiment of the Dharma. And that's where your consciousness then gravitates towards. It's the force of familiarization, as the Tibetans call it. So we don't all have a sadhana. I'm aware of that, and I'm aware that but we've all either got a sadhana or have asked to be given one by training for ordination within the Triratna Buddhist Order. So you will get one at one point. So I wanted to make a few sort of general points. So one of them is that in a way the process is still the same, even if you've got a sadhana or you've got an affinity to a Buddha or a Bodhisattva figure or not. What we're trying to do is move from the general principles of the Dharma to the specific application of the Dharma in our lives. And that's not just about a Bodhisattva figure. It's about what we reflect on in the Dharma itself, how we're bringing the Dharma closer to us and relevant and alive. So I'll just finish by making a few general points about that. So the first is just how to choose a Dharma reflection, or how to choose a Yidam or a Buddha or Bodhisattva figure. And I remember talking to Bhante about this. He was leading the study here, actually, for the Mitra conveners. And, well, actually, it was me or someone else, I can't remember. I asked him about reflection and how does one reflect? And he said, you don't choose the reflection chooses you. So you don't need to kind of consciously go and choose a Dharma reflection or a Buddha or a Bodhisattva figure with your habitual mind. With a reflection, you'll find that there's some Dharma, quotes of Dharma, that just stay with you, and you can learn them off by heart, but it's not even that much of a challenge to learn them off by heart, because you sort of want to remember it, and half of it's there already. Might be a bit of fine tuning, but the Dharma just kind of grabs you, it chooses you. Sometimes you don't even know why, Why would it be that particular expression of the Dharma? You feel a kind of strange pull, or you feel a strange pull towards a particular Buddha or Bodhisattva figure. The reason that I took up Vajratara ordination wasn't because I particularly liked Vajratara. In fact, it was the only chapter of Vajratara's book, Meeting the Buddhas, that I didn't read. And I didn't read it because the chapter title was Cheating Death. And I think I was probably 19 at the time or something. And the thing about 19-year-olds is that they don't think they're going to die. So cheating death didn't seem enormously relevant or exciting to me. So I didn't read that chapter. And of course, it was that figure that chose me. I definitely feel I had an experience where I felt the presence of Vajratara, which I couldn't handle at all. But I thought, I've been chosen. Better read the chapter. So you feel a pull towards a particular Buddha Bodhisattva. You don't have to understand why, or a particular Dharma teaching. You don't need to reason why. Just accept the invitation and follow that inspiration. One of the things that Bhante does is he quotes Yeats in saying that wisdom is a butterfly, not a gloomy bird of prey. So seeing where your imagination alights, where your inspiration alights. Something that you love. And he talks about that process, actually, the journey to Il Convento, about how you're drawn, how to take it seriously, to notice what you're drawn to without reasoning why. What are you drawn to? It's a really good essay, actually, Journey to Il Convento. And you can ask, if you don't want it to be governed by your ordinary habitual mind, the Maha-me, then you can ask one of your teachers, ask one of your friends. At the same time, so it's the same time as we follow our inspirations, the Yidam means oath-bound. And this is particularly when you get a sadhana at the time of ordination. You just stay committed to it, even when you're not feeling it. It's interesting that going back to the Buddha's interaction with Nakulapita, when he gives him a teaching, he says, this is what you should train in. He doesn't say this is what you should be inspired by, or even listen to, or even reflect on. He said, this is what you train in. The Dharma is a discipline, sikha, discipline. That's the word he uses. You train yourself in it, which means that when you are drawn towards a particular aspect of the Dharma, you keep going with it. The way the Buddhist tradition talks about it is he talks about the Samaya Sattva and the Jnana Sattva. So the Samaya Sattva is the Buddha or Bodhisattva figure that you're given at ordination, that you have a bond towards. Samaya means bond. So there's a being of a bond, there's a being of commitment, your commitment to that figure, to bringing that figure to mind every day. And then that gets filled from its own side, which is nothing to do with you, which appears as being outside of your consciousness. It's probably not, but that's how it's experienced. It's experienced as coming from outside of your consciousness. And that's the Jnana Sattva, the being of wisdom. So the being of wisdom that comes from its own side arises on the basis of the Samaya Sattva, the being of the bond, the being of commitment, which is really like saying it's the bond, it's the commitment that gives rise to wisdom. And I think in our reflection practice, I'm going to say something that you might want to discuss in your groups. I'm looking sort of nervously at the team. In reflection, I think we're oath-bound to Bhante. So we've all joined the Triratna Buddhist Order, or we've asked to join the Triratna Buddhist Order, which is an expression of Bhante's understanding of the Dharma. And because of that, because it's his order founded on his understanding, his translation of the Dharma, we are oath-bound to Bhante's translation of the Dharma. I quite like that, I have to say. I quite like being oath-bound to someone. It's quite challenging, but it behoves me as a member of the Triratna Buddhist Order to really try and understand what Bhante said and to reflect on it again and again and again. I have to say, this is what I'm in the mood for at the moment. I'm in the mood for just going back over all those old talks and really understanding them. And that's my oath, that's my vow. With loyalty to my teachers, I accepted my ordination. With loyalty to his understanding of the Dharma, his penetration into the Dharma. If I'm not oath bound to Bhante, if I'm oath bound to someone else or someone else's presentation of the Dharma, then I need to join a different order. So yes, what did he say? What did Bhante say about certain things? And we're so lucky, and we're particularly lucky at this particular moment in time, because last week something truly amazing happened, which none of you probably know about, which is that Vidya Devi finished the concordance of Bhante's complete works. So it's gone to the typesetters. So basically what that is you've got the whole complete works are now produced, basically. Well, they will be shortly. They're finished. The complete works. That's a legacy project of many people, including Vidya Devi, Satchalila, Kalyana Prabha, Kalyana Sri. Many people have helped it. And Vidya Devi's put together through her vast mind of understanding of Bhante's teaching. I don't know how she's done it. She's put together a concordance, which basically means that you can look up any subject and see what Bhante said about it and where to find it. I mean, that is extraordinary. It's like her mind is more than a computer, it's more than a search engine. And she's just downloaded her mind onto this concordance, and we'll be able to have that shortly. Such a resource for us in translating the Dharma for the modern world. So we are oath bound to Bhante and his understanding of the Dharma. And the third thing I want to say is that, that when we take on Dharma reflection, and again, this follows on from that point, and we take on a sadhana practice, or we take on a Yidam, we see it in the context of the broader Dharma teachings. So don't settle at a low level. Don't settle at a low level of a Buddha or Bodhisattva figure. We should be challenged by the Dharma to go beyond ourselves. The Dharma should never be entirely comfortable. If it's entirely comfortable, it's not enough. So we need to make sure that our understanding of the Yidam, or our attraction to the Yidam, our attraction to certain Dharma teachings, are within a broader context of the wider Buddhist tradition. So they're in the broader context of right view. That's very, very important. Of what the Buddha said, and in context of what the Buddha said. They're in the context of mindfulness, helping us to keep grounded in reality rather than our deluded stories about things. One of the things that Bhante said, a friend of mine had some visions of a particular Buddhist figure that were quite new. She hadn't seen them represented before. And she went to see Bhante about it, and he was so good. She told him all about what was happening in her mind, and he just turned to her and he said, "What are you developing?" So at any point we can ask ourselves, okay, well, what are we developing in our attraction to this particular Dharma teaching or to this Buddha or Bodhisattva? What are we developing? And we can explore that with our friends. We don't have to keep this a private exercise. We can explore our understanding of the Dharma, our attraction to certain Bodhisattva and Buddha figures with our friends, who might on occasion steer us in the right direction or keep us a bit grounded. We also keep our reflection on the Dharma and on the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas in the context of ethics. The Yidam, the sadhana practice, the Buddha or the Bodhisattva, the reflection on the Dharma should lead you closer towards the precepts. And I think this is important, particularly in our ordination. So our ordination, we don't just get a sadhana. we also receive the precepts at the same time. One leads to the other. And in a sense, one has to feel that one can stand in front of one's Yidam, the Buddhas or the Bodhisattvas, without remorse, or at least remorse that's contextualized. That we can stand before them revealing everything. If the Yidam doesn't lead you towards the precepts, it's not the Yidam. If the Dharma teaching doesn't lead you towards the precepts, it's not a Dharma teaching. If a Dharma teaching leads us to break the precepts, we are utterly deluded, and it is not the Dharma. The Buddha was very specific about this. He said, if it leads you to delight in the beautiful, it's the Dharma. If it leads you to delight in harm or violence, it is not the Dharma. Yeshe Sogyo was even stronger than this. It wasn't just that the Yidam leads us towards the precepts. She said the precepts are the Yidam, or the precepts are actually the Ishta Devata. She's very, very, very strong about that. The precepts are the Ishta Devata. Because they lead you to reality itself. So we keep the Dharma teachings within a broader understanding of the Dharma. We keep the Dharma teachings and the Buddhas and the Bodhisattvas that we're reflecting on within the context of the broader Buddhist teachings. But beware of literalism. Getting stuck on a literal form or meaning, getting stuck on the word. Sometimes we miss the journey to what gave rise to the words themselves. We miss the journey towards the awareness that's being expressed through form and words. We become a bit dry and formalistic. So at the time of receiving a sadhana, we get the sadhana written on a piece of paper. As accordance to the tradition. But I always say, don't feel limited by that. Have it because it's part of the Buddhist tradition. Go back to that broader context of the Buddhist tradition, but also sometimes just drop the form. Just go with one's inspiration. I call it pulsing between the form and then just seeing what's alive in the figure for you at the moment. You don't have to get stuck on the words. Seeing what, why did the Buddha say that? Why this form? We're moving, in essence, from the Yidam as being a psychological force. So psychological Yidam is the Yidam as something that's kind of positive and encouraging. So I visualize Tara, she's positive and encouraging, helps me feel a bit better about myself. That's the psychological Yidam. To the spiritual Yidam, so the spiritual Yidam is the Yidam that helps you cultivate spiritual states of mind belonging to the spiral path. So, for example, Tara might help you cultivate fearlessness or calm, all sort of part of the lower reach of the spiral path. And then we move from the spiritual Yidam to the transcendental Yidam. And this is Tara, or the Yidam, the Buddha or the Bodhisattva. That's a representative of reality itself. We're always trying to get behind the Dharma, the words of the Dharma and the images of the Dharma, the forms of the Dharma, to the awareness behind, which is transcendental. And this is represented by the blue sky, that the Yidam arises out as light out of a blue sky and dissolves back into the blue sky. So also represented by sometimes having a question, a central question or a koan that we ask. How does Tara's compassion arise out of emptiness? How does compassion arise out of emptiness? So we're moving from the psychological Yidam to the spiritual Yidam to the transcendental Yidam. We're moving towards being sprinkled from our training in the Dharma to being sprinkled by the deathless. From expression, from intellect to intimacy, where we recognize the Buddha himself, where we recognize reality itself, where we recognize and are united with the mind of the Buddha. So I'm just going to finish by reading something from a Padmasambhava Puja. It says, the Buddhas of the past, present, and future shine forth through the pores of his skin. His youthful smile is full of compassion. His 3 eyes gaze out into the matrix of light. Victory is his crown, and the 5 Buddhas and the luminous minds of the gurus and the protectors throng the 10 directions of space. They are like the rays of the sun, distinct and yet the same. They are not inventions of the mind, but the expression of the very nature of the universe. They are not inventions of the mind, but the expression of the very nature of the universe.